As always, first things first, name and title.
Lisa Rasmussen, City Council President.
Okay, so a lot of numbers thrown around here today for finance for capital improvement projects for the upcoming year. Give us, I guess, what we need to know about what's going to get done and what's not going to get done, hopefully, in 2019 if the city has their way.
Well, the Committee of the Whole's job tonight was to make a recommendation after running the projects through a scoring matrix to look at what they have money to pay for in 2019 versus what the needs are in the departments, and then make a recommendation to the Finance Committee, which it will consider next month, as to which of those projects will end up in the 2019 budget. And so they had about 30 projects on the list, and through some discussion, we are at the end of it going to be able to fund about 10 of those. So still 2/3 of them will be waiting. Often those projects reemerge and they get rescored the following year. Sometimes that happens, projects wait in line. But it really speaks to the integrity of the scoring matrix to make sure that when we select projects and draw a line for when funding runs out, that we aren't, unless there's a critical need, that we're staying with projects that are highly scored and highly ranked, and that we're not pulling off the bottom of the list and taking stuff off the top, because the rating matrix contemplates everything from the cost of delay to mission critical equipment, to the public's perception of need, to the levy impact, to economic benefits. And so when we run everything through that sieve and we come up with a score for those items, the bottom item that we scored tonight that is going to make the cut scored a 71 out of 100, and so everything else fell below that line. And so then what happens also is at the end of the year, or close to the end of 2019, we take another look at that budget, see if we have surplus or if we have cost savings from projects that we did that maybe came in less expensive than we thought. Then we kind of can go back to the list and see if there's a couple more things that we can still get done within that same money. And so it's kind of a moving target, but where we start is at least we could get those first 10 things covered.
And a lot of these projects, and one of the things you have to consider with these is sometimes federal funding, because if the project doesn't move forward, somebody could lose, money from a government grant or things like that.
That's
too,
true.
right?
In fact, by moving the line the way we did and getting the projects included that we did, one of the projects has a $144,000 grant from the FAA for an airport project, and we may have lost that funding, if we had not acted on it when our share was only $36,000. So, we're able to weigh those options and see, when it makes sense to move those things up on the list.
Another one of the projects that got kind of a lot of talk was upgrades for evidence storage for the police department, and that's something that, while it wasn't necessarily included right away, it looks like you might move forward with, but that's something that could also have a profound impact on the police department.
It does, and the police department was recently accredited by a state agency, and so obviously we want to protect that accreditation, and evidence storage is a component of that. They need to be doing it properly and judiciously, because when evidence is used in the commission of a crime, especially if it's a vehicle, or if it's, even if it's a boat or watercraft or a motorcycle, and there's loss of life involved, they have to keep that item, as Assistant Chief Barnes said, they need to keep that item in good order and preserve it as evidence for the life of the person that they have sent to prison. And so you could sit on those items for decades, and you need to make sure that they're properly cared for, because now with the rise of DNA evidence and DNA testing, if one of those cases would come up on appeal, they have to be able to take that evidence back out and retest it and locate that same, those same specimens. And if things are stored where, say, it was a car crash and, the windows are damaged in the vehicle and there's, water getting in, you couldn't store that stuff outside, because if it rains in the vehicle, you'd lose your evidence. And so for them to have a secure facility that also offers them room for growth over time certainly makes sense, and it was, condition critical for them that they not have things stored in, some hodgepodge manner in different locations, that they make a concerted effort to have an organized way to do that. So we were glad to fund that for them.
One of the things that Chief Barnes had brought up was, in a way in which kids can't jump the fence and throw rocks and damage the vehicle.
Exactly.
Like
in spite of your best efforts, if you store things outside, sooner or later they're going to come to harm, whether it's through the weather and the elements or whether it's through vandalism. It just happens. And so this facility that they're proposing has indoor storage. It's gated. It's got cameras. It's a secure storage facility. It's not just a fenced-in yard somewhere.
And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but this project is going to move forward. There's just a few things up in the air about how it's going to get funded,
It is,
right?
and what we would look at in the finance committee is the way we do the borrowing. So would we borrow it on a longer amortization or a shorter one, depending on what the cost of the borrowing is and what the cost of carrying the debt is. Only because we are planning to borrow on a 20-year amortization bond for a fire station. Obviously, that brick and mortar building will outlast that debt anyway, but if we could retire the debt from the evidence facility sooner, we may want to borrow that on a shorter timeline. So our finance director is going to get together with the city's financial planner and find out which is most advantageous to us, but yet carries the most minimalized impact on the levy. Because at the end of the day, municipal debt is covered by taxpayers and by their tax payments. So we need to make sure that we are not increasing the amount of money that comes out of people's tax dollar for debt service in an unrealistic way. I mean, we really don't want to impact the levy in a negative way. And so what we try to do is not borrow more in a year than we have retired. And every year the city pays off about $8.5 million in debt. And so we try to limit our new borrowing to at least what we've paid off so that that debt ratio isn't, continuing to escalate and affect our tax rate.
And one more before we let you go then, on that list that you talked about, we talked about a couple of the projects. Just give us maybe one or two other highlights on that list of improvements that
There's
are...
a couple of airport projects. One of them is that we have to update the Jet A fuel farm, which is our ability to sell the fuel that powers the Aspirus medical helicopter, which you see flying often in the city. The airport sells that fuel to that helicopter, and that's a huge revenue source for our field-based organization that runs that airport. So that revenue is split between the airport management firm and the city, and if we did not make that upgrade, it would restrict or negate our ability to sell Jet A fuel in the future. So that was very necessary, and that was one of the things that got approved. The evidence building is another big one. There was some ladder systems at DPW at their maintenance building that for workers' safety needed to be replaced. Those are OSHA requirements. We're able to meet that. And so, and also we're in the final phase of replacing handheld police communication radios. That's been a phased project where we've been doing about $47,000 every year for 3 years to make sure that we've replaced all of them. Originally, their radios were replaced with a FEMA grant about 10 years ago. That contract went to low bid. The radios were not dependable, and there was no local point of service when they didn't work. And so those items, while they were functional for the time, showed themselves to be deficient enough that the goal was certainly not to buy more of those, so we were able to move them to a reliable Motorola product with a local point of service, and so that helps them tremendously in having equipment that's dependable, that works, because their job is heavily dependent on their ability to communicate back to the base. So
Absolutely.
yeah, so that's one of the other things that scored real high, was to finish that for them.
Anything else we should know about these numbers then?
No, I don't think so. The Finance Committee will consider them in September. This is just a recommendation to them, but every year this is how we do it. This Committee of the Whole process allows the alder people from all 11 districts to weigh in on the decision making. It's not just the Finance Committee. It's not just 5 members on a standing committee, but we all have input into that, and they all participate in the scoring. So there's equal representation for the taxpayers of the entire city. It isn't just a few districts that are making that decision. It's all of them. So that really makes it a fair process.
All right.